So we've already heard quite a lot of good evidence for sea level rise, given the paleoecological record that Dr. Anderson talked about, and even economic valuation of some of the services, the ecosystem services that are being compromised by sea level rise and climate change that Dr. Sukop spoke about. And this is really grabbing the attention of water managers and resource managers in South Florida. And one of the things that they're concerned about are coastal wetlands and the ecosystem services that they provide. And so I'll talk a little bit about peat accumulation and the carbon stored in wetland ecosystems as a key ecosystem service that water managers are interested in maintaining and preserving. So we've heard a bit about sea level rise in South Florida. We as a state are highly vulnerable to sea level rise. We've heard about it. We know we're a peninsula essentially. So we have an expansive shoreline, low elevation throughout much of the coastal areas. We've heard about the Biscayne Aquifer that provides our primary source of drinking water in South Florida. Highly permeable aquifers, concentration of high population centers along the coastline, as well as high frequency of storms that are accompanied by tidal surge and that can compound the risks of sea level rise. So climate change, what we've heard a little bit about is that Florida is expected to experience warmer temperatures, more prolonged droughts, higher precipitation events, and more intense storms. And all of these factors impact the way that water managers manage the system now, and the future of these impacts are largely uncertain. And so this will make water management in South Florida more complicated as over time. So the influence of climate change on water management. So we have climate change drivers that come from the natural cycles, as well as human-induced drivers, which are associated with land use change and changes in greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Stressors coming from rising seas, temperature, rainfall, flood and droughts, tropical storms and hurricanes. Here we're focusing on rising seas. And water management impacts directly to the landscape through water supply, through flood control, and as well as to the natural system. So this sort of represents the multitude of stressors and drivers that water managers face as they try to manage the water supply and flood control in South Florida. So we've heard a little bit about the Everglades. There's a huge restoration project that's currently underway. It's been piecemeal and partially successful. Lots of iterations of this over time, but the overarching issue is that the extent of the Everglades landscape has been reduced in half. This is because land use has been allocated for urbanization, agriculture, and flood control, and water is redistributed for those uses. So we've had a loss of land area associated with the pre-drainage Everglades system, as well as a redistribution of how the water is used. So the restoration of the Everglades, one key component of that, is intended to minimize the impacts of sea level rise by increasing fresh surface water flow to freshwater and coastal wetlands. And one key component of that is maintaining wetland elevation. Increasing the freshwater head to limit saltwater intrusion of groundwater supply to protect and conserve human water supply, as well as limiting the risk to vulnerable and rare species. We'll hear a little bit more about that. But while Everglades restoration has a lot of important facets, there's also concern about trying to address these issues in the context of sea level rise. And water managers need support tools in order to make decisions about water supply and the timing of water associated with the restoration of the system. This is sort of a schematic of what a very gross graphic conceptualization of what the pre-drainage system looked like, how we've minimized water flow and redirected it out to the coastal areas, out to the west and east, and how what the focus is trying to redirect it through the Everglades as well as to the Biscayne Aquifer. So why are we concerned about the carbon balance of coastal wetlands associated with sea level rise and saltwater intrusion effects? So we've gotten a lot of good information about how sea level rise is changing over time, and one estimate puts it at over 0.5 meters by 2060 in South Florida. Peat soils, which are associated with an important ecosystem service in coastal wetlands, are crucial for maintaining wetland elevation in the coastal area. And little is known about the response of these particular types of soils in the coastal zone to accelerated sea level rise, nor the future of shoreline morphology and structure, which is a component of this that's important for water managers, as well as understanding the impacts of hurricanes, which hit the coastal zone. So the stability of coastal peatlands is of great socioeconomic significance, providing recreation, flood control, as well as a basis for Everglades restoration projects to be undertaken. So here's a quick photo of what saltwater exposure in freshwater coastal wetlands, what kind of impacts it can have. So one point about this is what we're trying to understand is the conditions under which we may lose or reduce the ability for peat soils to accumulate in the coastal zone. And this is associated with the decaying and die-off of the plant communities, as well as loss of the peat in and of themselves. So one way in which we try to get an idea of how peat soils in the coastal zone can change is by developing a mangrove, or by developing a soil carbon balance. So you guys probably all have bank accounts, and you probably often are checking them to ensure that you've got enough funds to pay for school, or going out on the town, or whatever it is. But essentially, a soil carbon balance is the same idea, where you have your bank account balance, and that is, let's say, your soil carbon, for example. And let's say you get a really good interest rate on the balance that's in your bank account. So you get 5% or something. So that is internal to the system. Whereas when you let's say you've got a 5% increase in your balance, but then you have inputs that are automatically transferred to your account each month, and you have expenditures each month. And so the relative input into your account, the output from your debits, and whatever interest rate is applied to your balance determines whether your bank balance goes up or down. So basically, a soil carbon balance or ecosystem carbon balance is calculated in the same way. So in the case of a mangrove soil carbon balance, which is one of those important ecosystems that many of us have talked about today, the inputs are in the form of production from plants, so plants that are increasing their leaves or roots with growth and metabolism. Another important input in the mangrove coastal zone is sediment deposition. That's an input. Outputs are from the decay of leaves or the decay of roots through decomposition, and then tidal flushing actually removes carbon or litter or roots from the soil. So your inputs plus your outputs and whatever happens to the soil carbon internally to the system determines whether you get more carbon over time or less carbon over time. And what we want is more carbon over time so that we can maintain wetland elevation as a key component to trying to mitigate the effects of sea level rise as sea level changes over time. And these are just a couple of photos of what these may look like. Roots, sediment deposition, litter export, litter decomposition. So now I'll talk a little bit about some of the research that we've done to try to understand the soil carbon balance of mangroves. So some of the work we've done has been focused on this area here. So this is a mangrove area. It's associated with the Florida Coastal Everglades LTDR program that Evelyn talked about, or Dr. Geiser talked about a little bit earlier. This is a long-term research site. It has very productive mangroves, so I think one of the photos that she showed you was of the very, very tall mangrove trees, and this is where that site is located. So what we did was take soil cores from that site, and we wanted to understand how salinity and inundation or flooding of those soils affected the soil carbon balance, but simply looking at soils. So you're probably clued in very quickly that we're missing the inputs from that experiment. So we're just taking the soil itself to understand how, when you increase salinity or inundation, what happens to the soils and how the soils lose carbon over time. And this is the location of where we conducted that experiment, and I'll show you a little bit about what that site looks like as well. So the Florida Bay Interagency Science Center is located in Key Largo. There we have an outdoor mesocosm facility, and what it allows us is the ability to create the type of salinity conditions that we want to use in our experiments, as well as allows us to create the water level or inundation types of conditions that we want to include in our experiments. But one really sort of complicated factor in trying to work with soils in mangrove systems like SRS6 that I showed you is that they're exposed to tides. So you get tides coming in and out twice a day, which at certain times of the year completely expose the soils to the air. And so when you're trying to recreate a system like that, it can really complicate your experimental capacity or your experimental facility, because you're trying to recreate a tidal system in something like this, a little box. So we had to be sort of innovative and try to do that, but we were ultimately successful. But in any case, what we had to try to simulate was a semi-diurnal tide. We manipulated inundation so that the soils were exposed to about 10 centimeters of above the water surface within these mesocosms. And we manipulated the salinity, so increased it. So it was a factorial design where we were able to manipulate salinity and inundation at the same time. So in order to get an understanding of what the pathways of loss are associated with soil carbon, there are different components of carbon cycling that are important to measure. For instance, in this particular experiment, we measured the carbon dioxide coming out of the soils as well as the methane coming out of the soils, in addition to dissolved organic carbon coming out of the soils. And what this is you might recognize it. I don't know if you guys spend much time at Home Depot, but this is a Home Depot bucket that we put a bunch of holes in and then tried to create a container for our soils. But Home Depot is incredibly useful if you're trying to do experiments of any type. Duct tape, PVC, you can get it all there. Anyway, so what we were trying to do is measure all of the pathways of carbon loss from these soil soil cores to try and understand how salinity and inundation impact the loss of carbon. And so we had to conduct a pilot experiment first off, and this was our first attempt at collecting cores. So it's buggy and it's messy, but once you get into the experimental facility, it all seems to work. So just quickly, these are just some of the data that you can generate or that we generated to try and get an idea of how carbon dioxide was being lost from the soils. And so ultimately, as you would expect, if you've got constant debits from your bank account, you're ultimately going to lose the balance in your account. And that's essentially what happened here, is that, we had the carbon loss pathways we got to the point where the soils were just slumping in the containers. There was nothing holding the soil together any longer because there were no inputs from plants, and therefore, what we can predict from this is that once the plants, let's say you have a plant that's susceptible to salt exposures, a freshwater sawgrass plant, for example, something we have here in the Everglades. Once that plant dies and is not producing the inputs to the soil any longer, those soils are going to be lost fairly quickly. And this experiment was over eight weeks. So this is an example of what the soils look like at the end of the experiment. So what's next? So I talked about how we were missing plants from our experiment. So this is a big new component of what we'll do in the future. We're going to focus on, instead of mangrove soils, our first next steps are to focus on sawgrass marsh communities in sort of the estuarine settings as well as freshwater settings in Everglades National Park. And so we have a project that's getting underway soon, focusing on Everglades sawgrass marsh, and we'll be working very closely with many of the projects and collaborators that you've heard from today. And here we're going to be focusing on, we're going to be getting a better handle on the soil carbon balance because we'll be representing not only the inputs as well, but as well as the outputs from our soil carbon to ultimately try to develop information with water managers that are involved in this project to help support their decision making as well as water management and other water management decisions. So this will be not only working in the outdoor music housing facility that I showed you where we worked in the past, but we're also going to be working in the field, manipulating the salinity levels in freshwater and estuarine type sawgrass marsh, and coupling sort of the more controlled experimental setting with something that you can do in the field brings more of a realistic capacity to the type of application that your experiment has. So you can imagine that if you're taking a clump of wetland out of its natural environment and putting it into an experimental facility where you're manipulating things, there are artifacts associated with that. You can understand what the processes are and why the soils and plants are responding as they are. but it makes it more difficult to apply those types of results to in a realistic context. And so the field experiment allows us to not only have more of a realized understanding of what's going on, but also allows us to apply those results at a broader scale. Okay, so I'll just wrap up with some of the implications of the work. Water management, so water managers trying to develop salinity targets associated with the water that they deliver, not only in the timing, but in the discharge, so the total amount of water that's being delivered to the system. And so if we can get a better understanding of the relationship between the water that's being delivered to the system and the salinity in these coastal wetlands that result, we can tie that back to the responses of the wetland plant community and how the soils will respond to those water management decisions. And the key aspect of the project is that we're working closely with the water managers, not only in developing the tools that come out of the project, but they are part of developing the project as well. So it's a very close relationship so that we can ensure that the results that we're producing are the types of results that they need to make the decisions that they need to for managing water supply in the Everglades. Okay, that wraps it up. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much. Dr. Bott's next. He's a resource economist at Florida International University's Earth and Environment program. He's part of the WSC project that Dr. Sukop talked about. And today he will be talking about the economics of the Everglades. Thank you very much.
Sure.